Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a weekly wrap up of non-fiction, which are 3 books that I've basically sort of been reading in between my fiction since January. And I'm going to start with On Origin of Stories, Evolution, Cognition and Fiction by Brian Boyd, who is an American academic. I wasn't sure if he was an academic in English literature or whether he was an academic in biology, but it turns out that he's on the literature side. And, you know, this is a book on origin of stories, looking at the sort of evolutionary benefits of us being storytellers and making up fictions. So, you know, a really important notion for writers and, you know, readers who are interested in that as well. But I think writers, you know, this is an important subject. And it starts off really well. I fear somehow after that it was a book of diminishing returns. So it starts off with a very good sort of overview of evolution through natural selection. Now, I've read the likes of Dawkins and Steve Jones, and I think this chapter holds up very well in terms of accessibility, intelligibility, all that sort of stuff. And I think it's a really good overview. It's not overly long, it's about 40 odd pages. So it sort of sets the table for the argument of this book really nicely. And then the second section is on, you know, the adaptation that human beings have made, that is art, you know. And it posits 2 things of sort of biological sort of drive towards art. One is audience, and the second is what he calls cognitive play. So coming to the point about audience is that art demands an audience, and you know, to do that it has to arrest our attention, us being the audience. Now I have several problems with this. First of all, the notion of you know, what about folk art, where someone has just decided to decorate or ornament their tools, their everyday tools. They're not looking to grab an audience by doing that. It's for their own personal aesthetic pleasure. So I'm not sure where that fits in, because, as I say, that's an individual, not a community or an audience-based drive. The second thing is there are other things that arrest attention and form audiences that are not art. So ritual and religion are 2 things, or particularly religious ritual, you know, come to mind for that. Although it may be performing a similar sort of function, you know, in demanding an audience, but, you know, it is not art. So what is unique to art that these things don't have, or is it doing it in a different way or for a, you know, a different end? So that, you know, that's another thing. And, you know, there's a difference between what he's going on to talk about, which is, you know, storytelling, narrative art, and art such as dance and music, because let's face it, there are many species of animal who employ either or both dance and music in order to attract mates. So again, you know, come back to the notion of the individual rather than an audience. So if someone makes a beautiful brooch, yes, on a community level that may show her status within the community, that, you know, she has the wealth to, you know, make this beautiful object and wear it. But it also might be something much more simple, that she's trying to attract a mate. So again, you know, once she has attracted a mate, but still continues to wear the brooch is not about community, you know, audience. You know, it's about the individual purpose of securing a mate. Anyway, so that is the audience part of this. And again, you know, what, on the same sort of Buddhist kind, as if a tree falls in a forest but there's no one there to hear it, can it in fact be said to have fallen? In the same way as if an artist makes art, but, you know, it doesn't really sort of, you know, find its audience, but he's still, or she's still making art, it just doesn't have an audience. So, you know, I have problems with this concept of audience, especially as being such a sort of primary argument in this book. The second point is about cognitive play, and I think this is more on the money, really. So if you think what play as a child is, it's, you know, pretend play. It's using your imagination to interact with the world, to master objects, you know, toys, to master situations, to recreate situations like dolls and all that sort of stuff. And it helps us assimilate the world, basically. That's what child's play is. Now, cognitive play is that, but done by adults. So it's to help us assimilate things in the world we don't understand. And I think that has merit. I'm not going to go into too much more detail about it because I'm now going to go on to the next section, which is specifically storytelling and narrative, by which the argument is that human beings are social animals. Well, I don't think we can disagree with that. And in any sort of social animal world, there is a balance to be struck between cooperation and competition in sort of evolutionary, biological, senses of those words. And this comes back to audience and grabbing attention by art. It's really important for us to interact socially, to be drawn towards and to give each other attention. And what is specific to storytelling is that through our imaginative creation of these characters who don't exist, but when an audience are reading about them or listening to them or whatever their deeds, the audience enter the minds of other people. So again, it's this notion of sort of social, of communal. So they may not be people they know, but they come to understand how those type of people think, what their motivations are. Are they people we can cooperate with, or are they people we have to be aware that they're going to, shaft us? You try and sort of, get in a position where you can predict what their intentions are. And that's, very clearly in, stories with goodies and baddies. And he uses the example of the Iliad, which forms the next section of the book, which is about sort of, social violations or violations of the social contract or social consensus have to be punished. They can't be allowed to go unpunished because otherwise the whole of society sort of, begins to crumble because of the laws on which it's built on, are threatened. And in the Iliad, a lot of that is about hospitality, and the gods demonstrate it just as much as mortals. And that's pretty much it, really. We learn about other human characters. We are invited into otherness. And then he gives these 200-page examples. One is of the Iliad, and the other is of Dr. Seuss' Horton Hears a Who, which was the final chapter before the conclusion, and I skimmed through it because I couldn't see the problem. The stuff with the Iliad was really interesting, sort of textual analysis, but I couldn't see how it made his argument, how it contributed any further to advancing his argument. And the same with Horton Hears a Who. I don't know if that was good textual analysis or not having read them, but again, I couldn't see what it was adding to the book. And this is what I'd say about diminishing returns. I was getting less and less in each section. I didn't think this made its own argument, but I still thought it was an important read because it got me thinking about notions of sort of audience and things like that. Notions of, one really thing that I'm very grateful to is, I've always been very aware that as children how we acquire language sort of by sort of mimicking sounds from our parents, and gradually they cohere into syllables, and syllables into words, words into phrases, phrases into sentences. And only later do we go to school and formalise all of that with alphabet, spelling, writing, grammar. And I've written about that in my fiction. I've used that quite a lot. But what this book pointed out is it's similar for the laws of physics, in that through play, through manipulation of matter, through coming to understand that objects persist, there's a sort of materiality to them, through defining where the edges are, where one object ends and another begins, all these sorts of things. We have a sort of intuitive grasp of the laws of physics long before we study it in science in school. And that got me to thinking about the templates in our back of our brain, with our sort of perceptive apparatus of eyes and visual cortex and all that sort of stuff. So it raised a lot of interesting questions and thoughts for me that I actually felt weren't really part of his argument. I didn't think his argument particularly moved me or impressed me or convinced me. But it was a worthwhile read all the same. So I would have given this book about 3 stars, but because it gave me a lot of other stuff outside of its own argument, I would raise that to 3.5 stars. Okay. And on to the next one, The Age of Spiritual Machines by Ray Kurzweil, who is a Google designer. Now, I picked up this book because I am writing a piece on transhumanism, which is the sort of concept of once our bodies start to sort of fail us through sort of biological decay, can we fashion alternative receptacles for our minds, our consciousness, be they downloads into some sort of sophisticated computer or be they cyborgs or whatever. That's something I'm writing about. And I picked this up because it deals with that. And I thought, okay, well, I'm going to read the introduction to this and then I'm just going to skip to the transhuman chapter. But, this book is written in such an ingenious way that I couldn't do that. I had to read the whole thing because it makes a very, very good argument. It was written in 1999, and basically Kurzweil is sort of looking ahead to the future development of technology and how that will affect mankind. And he uses, all sorts of techniques. He has an imaginary friend character called Molly, who sort of fires lots of questions to him, which, on our behalf as readers, really, are you really saying that? Do you mean that? Do you think that's going to happen? All those sorts of things. And then as he moves from the present, he makes sort of predictions of, he starts off in 1999, then he writes what's going to be in 2009, 2019, 2029 or 39, and then 2099. And Molly undergoes the sort of the transhuman transformations that he's positing. So she sort of, he's stuck in 1999, but this imaginary character Molly moves through all these sort of technological innovations. So it's ingeniously put together book. And it starts from the premise of what is called the law of accelerating returns. As order exponentially increases, time exponentially speeds up, i.e. the time interval between salient events grows shorter as time passes. And what he means by that is, if you think about computers, as computer technology wears on, we get greater and greater capacity on smaller and smaller chips. And, if you take the example of astrophysics and sort of, photography and studying the cosmos and processing all that on computers, you used to sort of bring this sort of huge sort of computational power by having lots and lots of different computers all sort of, stacked up in rows, and they would all be devoted to, processing the information because of the scale of it. And gradually, as computer technology has increased exponentially, you don't need rows and rows and rows of computers. You have things like quantum computers, and so computational power increases. And he sets that against Moore's law, which sort of says yes, but at some point there has to come a limit. It cannot go expanding forever. And he's sort of weighing that up in terms of, well, yes, it may or may not sort of go on expanding forever. But for example, the architecture of the human head, there is a limit there. So you will have to use sort of technology to augment the limitations of the flesh and bone skeleton. And it's a fascinating book. And in some places he's a bit sort of up himself about how clever he is, and in other places he's quite humble. Okay, I'm sure I'm going to get the timescales on these wrong, or I already have got the timescales on these wrong. But I don't know about people who are up on this stuff, whether they find this a bit basic or a bit risible because it's so badly out on its predictions. But for a layman like me, I thought this was a really, really good read. It didn't provide me a whole hell of a lot on transhumanism that I was looking for, but there's still enough good stuff in here that I would give this 4 stars. And finally, Our Band Could Be Your Life. Scenes from the American Indie Underground, 1981-1991. Michael Azerrad. The clue is in Our Band, because this is the indie music scene. A lot of the bands, there's 13 bands in here he covers. A lot of them I liked and I know of. Our Band Could Be Your Life is a lyric from my favourite band that he covers here called Minutemen. And it is a story of sort of American alternate stroke punk music from 81. I'm not going to go through the bands because if you're not familiar with them, it ain't going to be of interest to you. I'm going to talk about the more general things that I thought was interesting. I will list the punk bands below, so if you are interested in them, this book may or may not be for you. So on the one hand, it's sort of how bands were out of the mainstream, not part of the music industry, not part of the sort of, the treadmill of getting signed by a major label and all that, but were doing things on their own terms. So they were booking their own gigs. They were sort of, sleeping on friends' floors in the towns that they played their gigs at. They were hooking up with other bands from those towns to get information where to play it. So there was this sort of alternative network. And it definitely worked on the local musical level, but to posit that somehow this was an alternative cultural movement that could have swept America in new, interesting political directions is just a nonsense. And, the book is full of, creative and tensions between bands that, sow the seeds of their own implosions, because they, when you're living in someone's pocket on tour in a sort of cramped van and you're sleeping on the floor night after night after night, tempers fray. And in a way, you're sort of more amazed that any decent music was made in this way at all, because the seeds of destruction, would overwhelm that. I did find that the bands that I like, and I didn't learn anything more new about them because I'd done, I might have seen a documentary on them, like I had the Minutemen, or I just remember reading about them in the musical press at the time in the 80s. And the bands that I didn't know or didn't like, I have no yearning to go and re-listen to them, because, this book didn't do anything to revive any possible, revise my view of them. So there were bands that I liked, didn't know quite as much as were revealed in here, and then you just realise what rock and roll arseholes they were. So they've gone down in my estimation. Most of the bands, not all the bands, but most of the bands couldn't wait to sign up to a major label and abandon these indie roots, because there was more money to be made. So again, a sort of lack of idealism. So, and crucially, I think, I said that it did portray the creative tensions in the bands quite well, where that was true in most of the 13 bands, not all, but most. But why you could see why the bands split up inevitably, you didn't really get a sense of where their great music came from. And this is the problem with books on music. It's very hard to write about music. It's very hard to write about creativity. So novelists writing about novel writing, I personally find a bit self-indulgent. But at least it's legitimate, for them to sort of try and explore where their ideas come from, where their creativity comes from, and how that, sort of transfers to the written page. But music, reading about musical creativity is far harder to pull off. And this book doesn't do it at all. I was really disappointed in this book, as I say, for a host of reasons. One, because I felt it was an idealism that wasn't true. Two, because I didn't get anything new from the bands that I knew less about. Three, because it was unable to unlock the key to musical creativity. So I gave this 3 stars, and it was kind of lucky to get that. Okay, so till next time, thanks very much.